Hello! I'm LegenTerry, and these are my first impressions of Metaphor ReFantazio, a JRPG developed by Studio Zero and published by Atlas. I like RPGs. I've never played a Persona game. It's not that I'm opposed to playing any of them eventually. I mean, I actually own Persona 5 Royale, I just never got around to starting it. It's a big time commitment, you know? But the high school setting and the social hangouts and dating sim elements just really don't do a lot for me. So if you're looking for someone who will draw perfect lines of comparison between Metaphor and Persona, or by extension Shin Megami Tensei, that ain't me. I'm pretty much going in with fresh eyes and ears. Now, just because I haven't played the Persona series doesn't mean that I haven't been subjected to the absolute mania surrounding the games. I know that at the very least, they're considered great games, and have been important to the RPG genre itself in a lot of ways. I acknowledge and respect that, so I'll use what limited knowledge that I do have about them to make talking points when applicable. Hearing about this game before its release instilled a lot of confidence in me, and my belief that I would actually enjoy it. It would retain the same stylish design philosophy, deep combat systems, and character-first storytelling that Persona was known for, while being moved to a high fantasy setting with bigger stakes and a lot of political intrigue. The characters would be more mature than their predecessors, and their problems would extend beyond the confines of a high school. Their world is cruel and its lessons are learned hard. Just a heads up, spoilers for the first few hours of the game begin here, and it's going to be really difficult to tiptoe around the details. There's a demo that lets you play through most of the stuff I'll be referencing, so don't be afraid to jump in for yourself and come back later to hear me break it all down. Hopefully, I'll catch most of you on the other side. The game's story kicks off with a bang. A man named Lewis stands above the frail form of a bedridden king, lying silent and motionless in a clear decline of health. Lewis plunges a dagger into his chest as he denounces the royalty's failure to unite the world's many tribes and create a utopia, as he had once claimed was his dream. With the king murdered, and his heir, the prince, missing for many years and assumed deceased, fear that the kingdom will be vulnerable to the threat of war from inside and outside rise. The room full of aristocrats, nobles, and clergymen are in complete dismay, but Lewis, now revealed to be someone of high esteem among the ranks, steps forwards to posit the question: who will now lay claim to the throne and the royal magic that protects the kingdom of Uchronia? Elsewhere, our protagonists rise toward the city of Grand Trad, the place where the king was assassinated in a horse-drawn carriage. Several strangers and a friendly fairy named Gallica sit alongside us. Before it can reach its destination, the carriage is attacked by a band of thieves riding aboard a gauntlet runner, a massive ship-like vehicle with legs. They claim to be part of Lewis's militia, attempting to steal everything of value in his name. When our lead refuses to hand over a suspicious book, another man seizes the opportunity to escape, but is cut down in the process. As violence breaks out, a red-haired elf woman who is also a passenger springs into action and takes control of the situation. But not before we're kicked over the edge of a cliff. But we're mostly fine, and after a short hike through the desert avoiding the local monsters, we reach the city. Gallica reminds us that we're on a secret mission of extreme importance, and guides us to be recruited into the military so we can meet with their undercover contact on the inside. Along the way, we make friends with a young nobleman named Stroll in the recruitment office who seems to have his own objectives. As we approach the fort that we're assigned to train at, we get yanked into a combat scenario that nobody saw coming. We open the doors to find an absolute bloodbath, and the ferocious monster that's responsible for it.
There it is. That's a human.
I probably should have mentioned it earlier, but this game has a bit of a thing for breaking the fourth wall, and if it wasn't obvious enough yet, the game probably isn't called Metaphor for no reason. After that initial cutscene with Lewis and the King plays at the beginning, a mysterious narrator says that he can feel your eyes prying into their world and asks for your name, as in your actual name, before you're allowed to name the protagonist later on. He goes on to say that the world we witness in the game could be described as a fantasy to an outsider, and then asks whether we believe that fantasy can hold any power over reality, or if it's just a powerless means of entertainment. And yeah, that's the level of heady philosophical business you're about to jump into. The population of the world of Uchronia is composed of 8 different tribes, none of which are normal human beings. There are some pretty simple ways to distinguish most of them. Resants are the elf people with the pointy ears, and Clamars have horns protruding from their heads, but other tribes have features that aren't so pronounced at first blush. Our protagonist, who looks just like a normal human being, is actually referred to as an Elda, a tribe that's extremely rare who are thought to have all practically perished long ago. Elda are also what the characters call one of the lesser tribes, alongside the dog-like people called Parapus and a few others. If you couldn't tell, Metaphor, which I refuse to call by its full name any longer, isn't interested in being very subtle. This stuff is front and center in the story, and your party is going to find themselves at odds with figures who perpetuate the status quo. Right out of the gates, you're confronted with some pretty heavy topics like the aforementioned racial discrimination and hate-fueled violence, the damage that blind faith and religious zealotry often cause, and the dangers of allowing terrible people given positions of power the ability to stand unopposed. But it isn't all doom and gloom. Once the ball gets rolling, the single thread that isn't extremely obvious at first starts to cut through the tension, and that is hope. Hope that things will get better. Hope that goodness will prevail over evil, and that if we all pull together, we can make a difference and enact the change that we need, even if it only seems like a fantasy right now. Try to hold on to that thought, it'll come back around later. But first, I just want to say thank you to all of you who have subscribed recently and stuck around for another video. Navigating YouTube's algorithm is like the Wild West, and these kind of videos unfortunately take a long time to produce. The algorithm does not understand that or care. What it does appreciate is when people interact with a video in any way. Clicking the thumbnail when it shows up in your sub box, clicking the like button, or just leaving a comment of any kind does wonders for a video's performance. So if you haven't done any of those things yet, don't worry, we're still cool. But it'd be a lot cooler if you did. Now, I do wish the plot ball had gotten rolling a little bit faster. There's a lot of exposition in the first few hours of the game. Trust me, I know, I'm already 13 paragraphs deep and I haven't even introduced the power system, elaborated on those things, or told you anything about the secret mission the protagonist is on. So bear with me a little longer and I'll try to speedrun this to catch you up. Everyone calls these big ugly monsters with oddly familiar features humans. Also, their visual appearance is based on the works of the real-world 16th century Dutch artist Hieronymus Bosch, known for being one of the first surrealist painters. Are they some kind of metaphor? Are we the baddies? Probably, but that's one of the big mysteries cooking in the background, and I don't have an answer for you yet. When you confront this human, you end up tapping into a form of magic that everyone seems to have forgotten about called Archetypes. These are like literal embodiments of character archetypes from a fantasy story given physical form, and in gameplay, they each offer a set of unique abilities and synergies. We'll talk more about them later. And, well, all of this work that the protagonist has been doing is to save his childhood friend, the prince that everyone presumed dead, because now he has a rightful claim to the throne and Louis can't be allowed to rule by force. The rest of the plot has a lot of intricacies, but I don't want to chew your ear off forever, so I'll leave those for you to dissect on your own. How do I feel about it all? Well, I like the direction the story's going in, and all the twists and turns it's had up to the point that I've played. The plot is very front-loaded and gets a bit heavy-handed at times, but it also wasn't overwhelming to consume. The prologue section of the game lasts for roughly 10 hours, which gave the writers plenty of runway to inject more information where it was necessary. The sheer amount of tutorials that bombard your screen is a bit distressing, but again, they come in the form of a steady stream rather than an open floodgate. There are systems on top of systems, many of which I assume were previously found in Persona and SMT, and they gotta let you know how to navigate and use them effectively. 30 hours later, and they're just now informing me that bad weather can affect things that happen in combat. Now, because of those tutorials, it did feel like I got railroaded for a pretty long time before they finally let me take the training wheels off. You don't even get to leave the capital city for over a week of in-game time, which made me very concerned at first. Luckily, the pace picked up immediately after completing the initial dungeon, putting most of my fears to rest, but we'll talk about that when we get to gameplay. The voice acting is phenomenal, especially where all of your party members are concerned. It shouldn't really surprise you to know this since this is an RPG, but you do eventually pick up more members for your entourage, and a couple of the ones you pick up later in the story stand out really well. I wish I could mention them by name, but I wouldn't want to spoil the surprises. I'll just say that you definitely won't expect the way one of them looks or sounds, but they're my absolute favorite. As a stark contrast, however, the protagonist character might be my least favorite thing about the game. As far as the story and gameplay go, he's pretty much just a blank slate, but I do not like his visual design or his voice at all. This goofy little heterochromatic Marth knockoff and his bright white peacoat just look lame to me, and I don't like to drag voice actors, but every time the protagonist speaks, I can only imagine him standing in a sound booth saying every single line through gritted teeth.
What's a magic igniter? Can someone catch me up here? Don't worry, my friends all talk. Hey!
Sorry, Caleb Yen. I'm not familiar with any of your other work. I'm sure you're a great person, but this performance, I do not like. I was also caught off guard by the presentation of the game. As most would expect from the studio that made Persona 3, 4, and 5, the visual effects team and the user interface team went absolutely crazy. If I know one thing that Studio Zero has learned to do exceptionally well, it's making cool fucking menus and combat that makes you feel like a shonen anime hero. But a lot of Metaphor's visual details are unrefined in a way that's not too easy on the eyes for reasons that are beyond me. For perspective, this is a game that's been cooking for 8 years, and with the way some of these environments look and feel to run through, it seems like they were low on the list of priorities. Now again, I don't know a ton about their other games, but compared to the footage that I have seen of Persona 5 in motion, some of the stuff I've looked at in Metaphor feels like either an incoherent choice in the overall art direction, or a lack of attention to detail that was sorely needed. Most of the locations are muted and drab with minimal clutter or interesting scenery dropped into them. Almost all of the dungeons I've been to so far consist of a bunch of narrow hallways with really simple geometry and splotchy textures along the walls and floors. The air itself is filled with these little light blue strands of quote-unquote magla, the in-game world's version of magic, which covers the entire screen in an extremely obnoxious layer of random shapes everywhere you go. Some of this stuff was likely done to match the painterly oil canvas look of the Hieronymus Bosch works that inspired the team, and it's not like I was expecting the vibrant lights and colors of a modern Tokyo setting, but I don't feel like I've seen that much variety in the locales so far. And that criticism extends to the other stops that you make along your journey as well. Sometimes you'll hear about a place that sounds really fascinating to explore, and when you get through the loading screen, it'll just be a literal JPEG image, like the static backgrounds of Final Fantasy VII on the PS1, or a storefront with no visuals and a disembodied vendor speaking from off-screen, like Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. Though I have to admit, that comparison might be a bit too harsh, since those games were a technical dumpster fire. Paired with inconsistent anti-aliasing, stutters in the animations during load screens, and some other technical oddities at play, it makes it seem like some shortcuts were taken in development. When it comes to the first point, I think some destinations were probably intended to be a bigger deal before their content was scrapped and reduced down to their current form, but I'm drawing a blank on the technical issues. You would think they would have had plenty of time to polish over the last 8 years, but maybe this game was only seen as sort of a side project for the developers not focusing all of their attention on Persona games full time or something. We'll probably never know. What I do know is that the gameplay and the RPG elements therein are where Metaphor really starts to show off. Even if I have a couple of hangups about certain parts, I have to admit that it's pretty excellent. The entire game operates on a calendar schedule, which won't be anything new to Persona fans. But basically what that means is that you need to plot out how you spend your time wisely, as different activities take up different amounts of time. I've never really been a fan of games putting me on a timer because it's always felt too restrictive. I'm the kind of person that likes to explore and exhaust every option to feel like I'm squeezing every drop of content possible out of a game, and time limits just make me anxious about permanently missing things that I won't be able to see unless I replay the game. But what's great is that Metaphor doesn't have a traditional timer actively counting down the seconds, like Majora's Mask or Pikmin or Dead Rising, which means that you can strategize rather than stress. Each day is split between an afternoon and an evening cycle, giving you 2 different time slots for activities. These are where the social sim elements of the game lie, and they're also how you form bonds with some characters and improve what the game calls your royal virtues. You see, soon after the part of the story that I left off on earlier, the plot eventually advances into an actual political race, with your character campaigning on behalf of the prince. I know, everyone here in the US is already exhausted at the mere thought of elections by now. Let out a big groan if you have to, but I'm asking you to set those feelings aside. Check your bags at the door and just let the writers take you for a ride through their own political drama with a fantasy twist. Now, you can kind of think of the royal virtues as stats that work outside of combat and give you access to new side quests and followers. For example, a person may think that your character is too young for a task, so you'll have to prove to them that you have more wisdom than your outward appearance would suggest. Some of these stats, like courage, have sources such as completing bounties or spending time with certain allies that are much easier to come by than others. So you'll need to do some scouting to make sure you're getting the most bang for your precious time. On the flip side of the coin are dungeons. Rather than spending half a day improving one of your royal virtues, venturing into a dungeon takes up the entire day, as you can only enter them in the afternoon and must exit them at night to replenish your team's health. This gives you the chance to amass experience points for your characters and their archetypes, along with collecting items and progressing questlines. But you also have to plan out how long you're going to spend inside the dungeon, because your special attacks use mana that can only be recovered with a finite supply of mana recovery items. Stick around any longer and you'll have to resort to standard melee attacks that don't hit very hard or sweep across multiple enemies, possibly making some encounters lethal. Most dungeons are pretty lengthy and are intended to be explored over the course of several days, but you could also forgo collecting all of the loot and experience from fighting low tier enemies and make a mad dash for the boss fight at the end instead, although I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. And that brings us to combat. Just like previous games, Metaphor is turn-based, but there's also a bit of action involved in how you go about initiating it in the overworld. When you see an enemy, you can press L2 to scout out how strong they are with Gallica's senses, lock onto them with the tap of an L1 button, and then press square to dash in melee. After 3 to 4 hits on most enemies, they'll stagger and reel back, allowing you to initiate the fight with them stunned in the first round. You're even able to skip a fight entirely if your party outlevels the competition by a wide enough margin. Some much appreciated quality of life when you feel the need to grind XP. Though sometimes when there are multiple enemies on the field, you'll need to quickly choose which target to pursue and dodge out of the way of others with the circle button so you don't get hit. If that happens, you'll be put on the back foot instead. My issue with this system is that the controls and the camera movement just don't feel great in a live environment. Even after adjusting the camera speed, it's hard to turn it around smoothly because it wants to snap in different directions, or will get put behind the architecture of the dungeon. And when you're quickly ping-ponging from target to target, skipping through fights for XP, it's hard to tell where you're going to wind up next. Something that becomes infuriating when you're fighting in a tightly knit area with a mix of low tier and high tier mobs. Your attack timing in the overworld also changes depending on which archetype your character is using, as they each hold different weapons. So if you've been getting used to playing as a healer, swinging a mace that takes a quarter of a second and only hits directly in front of you, changing to the mage who creates an AoE burst that takes about a full second for each hit has a funky learning curve. Thankfully, the turn-based combat itself is still some of the best and most interesting in the industry. Assuming you've spent the necessary currency to study, any of your party members can make use of any archetype, though it should be noted that some will be better suited to certain roles based on their initial stats. The more bonds you made with NPCs along your journey, the more archetypes you'll have at your beck and call. It isn't completely necessary, but I would recommend making the protagonist your go-to magic guy, at least for the early game, since you'll be sorely lacking in those options for a while. I know this is quite different from Persona style of monster collecting and fusing, but it still feels like a solid system in its own right. In combat, each of the turns that your characters and enemies can take are represented by these little crystal icons at the top of the screen. But if you manage to hit an enemy with their weakness or score a critical hit, or select the pass option, you'll only use up half of your turn, meaning that you can wrap back around to fully double the amount of actions that you take with enough forethought. This is a very powerful tool that you should keep in mind at all times. On top of your standard attack, guard, items, and pass options, you have your archetype abilities, which come from whichever archetype you have enabled on that character, and synthesis skills. These are unique team-up attacks that burn up more turn crystals, but can significantly change the flow of a fight. Things like casting a defense up buff for your entire party that lasts for 3 turns, or dealing a devastating blow that leaves the enemy with a new weakness type for a turn. Depending on the makeup of your party's archetypes, you'll be able to activate different synthesis skills with different combinations. This may even leave a character with no synthesis skills at all, making reviewing your team's layout before committing to different archetypes extra important. I love how many options the game puts at your disposal when it comes to combat. The variety of enemy types will have you cycling through practically every strategy in the playbook to come out on top. More often than not, fights become like a kind of puzzle box that you have to figure out a solution for. There are a few moves that you'll be able to rely on for a majority of the situations, but sometimes enemies will be outright immune to certain types of damage like piercing or fire magic. And when they get struck by those, your turn will end immediately, and they'll get to retaliate with a turn of counterattacks. While it's not very complicated towards the beginning of the game, fights can become dire fast if you don't study your foes and devise a proper plan to deal with them. There are also some pretty sharp spikes in difficulty the deeper that you get into the game, but most of the time you can get a heads up on tricky encounters by speaking to one of the informants who hang out in the major cities. They'll even leave a note in your inventory with recommendations for what archetype combinations and damage types you should try to use against the enemies in the dungeons. Now, I've left a little plot of land towards the end of the video here specifically for music, because the first time I heard the main battle theme, Warriors in Valor, I was sold. I don't know what the hell he's saying because I'm just a dumb American who only speaks English, but I mean, holy shit. Just listen to it. Why does this go so hard? It's the thing you're going to hear the most in the game, and canonically, it's just playing inside your character's head all the time thanks to Galka's magic, which is hilarious when you think about it. You hand her the aux cable and she busts out the Gregorian chant monk rap like an absolute psychopath. It's the most unique track that I've heard in a video game in years, and I absolutely adore it. Most of the other songs on the soundtrack probably won't give you quite as much whiplash or hype you up as much, but they're still pretty good. It's definitely a departure from what longtime Atlas and Persona fans have come to expect, but with the shift in tone and the fantasy setting, it fits pretty well. Lots of grandiose and uplifting orchestral numbers remind you that you're on a hero's journey filled with magic and medieval warfare. There's heavy emphasis on string and horn sections, and all the vocalization is done in a little-known language called Esperanto. And this is actually one of the reasons why I wanted to give the music its own dedicated part of the video, because the story behind it is so damn fascinating. I don't think that the game itself will disseminate this information at any point, but Esperanto is a language that was created by a Jewish doctor named Ludwig Zamenhof in the late 1800s. Growing up, he lived in a town that was segregated by 4 different citizenries: Russians, Poles, Germans, and Jews. Each of them spoke their own languages, and that language barrier divided them and made them all see each other as enemies. Growing up in that environment as a young boy, he decided that he would invent a new auxiliary language, one that was meant to be learned alongside a native tongue and be easy to learn in a relatively short period of time. That way, people could communicate universally, without fear, to build a community of speakers who would strive to understand rather than a world dominated by war. In Metaphor, there's also a diegetic written language that appears to be gibberish, but actually uses a stylized English or Latin alphabet that can be translated through Esperanto. As an idealist seeking world peace, many of Dr. Zamenhof's peers likely saw his vision of the future as a fantasy. You at home probably do as well. He never actually named his creation, simply referring to it as the international language. But the early adopters of his language that embraced the ideals it represented came to call it Esperanto. And do you know what the word Esperanto translates as? One who hopes. That is some tremendous dedication to theming. I felt more and more rewarded for my initial curiosity in Metaphor as I played, and it quickly became one of my favorite gaming experiences of the year. Its art style is bizarre and interesting, setting itself apart from the herd. The characters are strongly written and fun to hang out with. Its turn-based combat feels both snappy and fluid to handle simultaneously, and never stops being clever in its execution. The story is engaging from many angles. It's a more mature take on Studio Zero's previous games with a lot to say, but it also isn't afraid to reel that back for some adolescent humor from time to time. If you're keen to sink your teeth into a lengthy RPG, rich with deep systems, a self-aware fantasy narrative, and one of the most distinctly memorable battle themes in history, I strongly recommend checking out Metaphor ReFantazio.